Alrighty, my friends, so on to the last video for this particular module. So we started with looking at what happens with wolves when we take them out of a system, intentionally or unintentionally, right? So we had wolves into an ecosystem, we hunted them to predation, took away their habitats, etc. And then we kind of followed that up with what happens to population ecologists? What kind of questions do they ask? What sort of examples would we be able to get from that? And now I want to wrap this whole module up with talking about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. So that's what we're going to do here. And then how could these 5 questions help monitor and restore these populations? Again, I know we really just considered the first 3 questions, but you can also try to consider the last 2 as well. So this here is a graphic that was actually from a previous edition of your textbook, and I wanted to reintroduce it here because I think it really nicely kind of visually shows what happened, right? So we learned the presence or absence of wolves has major effects on an ecosystem and basically like down the line repercussions. Initially you take the wolves out. If you listen to some of those podcasts that I recommended before, one of the reasons that you hunted them was, oh, they're going after our cows, that kind of thing. So you want to take them out so they're not ruining your livestock. And so what ended up happening several years later is without the scientists, figured out like, okay, so without the wolves, there's more elk, right? So wolves are a main predator for elk. And the elk population actually ended up doubling, and elk like to eat willow trees. So that led to fewer willow trees, which actually led to the demise of beavers, because beavers like to, go in on those willow trees as well. And if there's not any willow trees for the beavers to have, then that means there's going to be fewer beaver dams, which meant less pools of water, also a little bit less groundwater, kind of an interesting little thing there as well, which subsequently led to less fish. So with, initially you have wolves, and then without wolves, you kind of have too many elk, which is what this is trying to show here, which takes away all of the, or a lot of the willow trees. Ain't got no willow trees, you don't have any beavers and less songbirds, etc. Right? So it's a basically like cascading sort of like almost domino effect of taking out one species can completely decimate an entire ecosystem. But then when wolves were reintroduced, then this cascade sort of lessened. The populations of elk decreased quite a bit, which allowed for willow trees to come back. And by the way, the reason that the willow trees it's not like adult willow trees necessarily. Elk actually more like to eat the saplings, especially the younger elk prefer to eat like the little saplings of willow trees, and so they weren't able to grow into their like adult stages of tree, which I thought that was really, really interesting. So over time, once wolves were reintroduced, things were able to kind of go back to normal, if you will, or to what the ecosystem looked like probably before humans had time to put our little fingers into things. So just a really interesting way to kind of consider how things can be destructive down the line when you don't even think that it's like that big of an impact, right? And this is actually something that goes into when you're considering environmental impacts of little things. Like this is a really large conversation in climate geoengineering, and things like that. So if you're really interested in climate change or climate geoengineering, I encourage you to kind of look into those ideas, and kind of think a little bit deeper now that now that you're loaded with this knowledge of like one little change can have an everlasting and domino effect of a region down the line. Then it helps us kind of think a little bit more critically about what we could or should not do. The last thing that your book goes into in terms of this whole kind of idea, that I'm just going to really touch on, I don't want to kind of hone too far into it. Your book goes into much greater detail than what I'm going to share here. But there's basically two ways to kind of regulate this. You have a top-down regulation where you have the control from predators high on the food chain. So in this case, we were looking at wolves, right? And so wolves and other predators are the primary force of keeping elk population into check, which then plant populations are then regulated by the feeding pressure of herbivores like elk. So, if you have more elk, you're going to have less plant populations because they're going to be the ones eating those plant populations. But if you have, from the top of the food chain, if you have more of them, then you're able to kind of like control what happens down the line. And I just thought of this, another sort of ecosystem that's super important is that of sharks. And shark populations. A healthy coral reef is a coral reef with sharks because they are the top of the food chain. And if they are able to keep the fish that prey on the coral in check, then everyone is happy-go-lucky. Then on the other side, there's this bottom-up regulation where the control is from the bottom of the food chain. So elk populations are determined by the availability of food. So if there's less willow trees, then there's going to be maybe less elk there, right? Because if they don't have anything to eat. And then wolves population size then determined by the number of elk and other prey. So just some interesting kind of ideas where you're like thinking about these things. And what your book goes into in terms of this bottom-up situation that I just want to touch on is that in many decades where wolves were absent, then the elk populations crashed periodically when food was scarce because willows were not there due to drought, extreme winters, or overgrazing, right? So kind of from the bottom of the food chain going upwards versus as the top of the food chain going downwards. So really interesting ideas here, I think. And as I was mentioning before, try to consider these ideas in other different ecological areas of the world, not just where we're focusing on or where your book focuses on in Yellowstone. Really think of different habitats and different species and different things all over the place that can actually be severely impacted by these down the line or up the line or upstream impacts. So thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next week.